Good morning. This is Steve Onsman from Calvary United Church of Christ in Reading, Pennsylvania. We are open and affirming congregation, and I am here on the 17th of November, 2021, for the Wednesday Word. And I hope when you watch this, you'll consider maybe sending me a question so I can do this again in the future. I will only do them when I get a question. So this is me trying to answer a tough theological question or biblical question in under 7 minutes. This one comes from our friend Elliot Werner, who stays connected with us, even though he lives too far really to come in. It's wonderful to get this from him. He writes, scholars divide Isaiah into three sections from three different authors and three different time periods. Is there a unifying theme to all of Isaiah? Kind of, sort of. The problem with Isaiah, yes, is that it is considered to have multiple editions over time, and that this is a pretty common thing. What some scholars would call a forgery, in a sense, not bad forgery like we think of, but a forgery. The gospel is the same thing as talked about in this way by scholars, that they weren't written by the person they're named after, but they're written in the name. Maybe they're people who are of the school that they knew them, or it was their granddad or something like that, grandmother. So yeah, that's part of the issue. And Isaiah, we don't really know. In fact, I've read some experts in Isaiah that say they think the third part is written by a woman, and we'll get to that in a minute. One of the early themes, of course, is that this Isaiah is writing in a time of transition. At least at the beginning, right? The year that King Uzziah died, which was around 740 BCE, Isaiah heard God called him to be a prophet. It's massive change going on. Syria authority was imposing authority. Kings were in trouble. A few years later, Israel and Damascus form a defensive alliance, and they try to convince Ahaz to jump in there and join them. He says no, so they invade Judah, and it's a messy time for Israel. And so a prophet arises, Isaiah, and talks about early on in Isaiah. There is a theme. There's a lot of concern about the rebellion of Judah, for example, against God. The question of judgment. There's a lot of judgment in the beginning, at least in the first 21 chapters, not just against Judah, Israel, but also against the Assyrians and Babylon and Moab and Ethiopia. There's all kinds of judgment being placed here, and then this real concern about following other gods, which always seems to come up in the prophets. People tend to do that. You get into the second aspect of it, the second part of Isaiah, this more judgment coming along. So maybe judgment is one of the themes, through there. But that God will save the people, that there will be exile in the future. There's a lot of this discussion going on, and that there will be a servant. The suffering servant kind of appears through. And this, of course, is placed on Jesus, although honestly Jesus was a suffering servant, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Isaiah was talking about Jesus particularly, although a lot of people would say he was. The restoration will come through Cyrus, the king of Persia, and other nations and their gods will be brought low. So there is sort of this redemptive aspect. And then we get into the third party. There's the vision of restoration, where the call to keep the Sabbath and the importance of different aspects like fasting and the need for justice, and that injustice will bring about God's judgment. A lesson to be learned, I think, from many nations, and that after all of this is done, the remnant will be saved. So there's that, I guess, would be one of those themes that judgment, as in many of the prophets, judgment brings about repentance, which brings about restoration, and then a small group will be saved in that end. Just about that there's a vision of renewal that needs to be accepted, that there's a need for transformation in the larger culture, not specific to Isaiah, just specific to the prophetic call, and that if the people were to focus on what's good for Israel, what's good for God, that they will find there will be hope there. But the people of Judah and Jerusalem are often laden with guilt. They turn their back on God. They don't listen to the prophet. The kings don't behave themselves. So these are sort of ongoing things, and that it is always God's intention that that people should do God's work. And so again, we have the suffering servant, who is sort of the covenant, the light to the Gentiles. It's a sense of inclusion. So in 7 minutes, it's impossible to make this any clearer. But that's where I get it. There's judgment, there's repentance, and there is renewal. And that is something that all the prophets talk about. So that's all I've got for today. Hope you'll share this, talk back, give me some information, send me an email, let me know if you've got a question you'd like answered. And when I get those, I will do another Wednesday Word. Have a great day. Be safe out there, and I'll see you soon.